Yeah.
Some of you maybe the first time, and we're going to record it as well. I'm going to share my other screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Neil Best. I'm a town planner at the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and this is webinar number 5 of the Northwest Community Energy Pathway series. This is part of a programme funded by the Northwest Net Zero Hub and delivered by CAG Consultants and ourselves, the Centre for Sustainable Energy. And this programme supports the community energy sector in the Northwest, both through providing expertise and also sharing back best practice. I'm going to be speaking part of the evening tonight. I'm joined by my colleague Dan Stone from CSE, who's giving you a wave there. Dan is also a chartered town planner at CSE. And we've also got my colleague Lucy Rothwell on the call. And we're also joined, we're delighted to be joined by some colleagues at Renew EV, John Rawlins and John Malone, who will introduce themselves later on. So let's get going. Just a little bit about CSE. We're a charity based in Bristol. I'd love to say that it was nice and sunny today in the southwest, but it was not. CSE is a charity. We support people and organisations across the UK to tackle the climate emergency and end the suffering caused by cold homes. We're about 140 people in size in terms of staff, and we've been going for about 40 years. And this is one of a number of projects that we run. Here's an agenda for tonight. So there's going to be a mixture of speaking and an opportunity for you to ask questions. We're going through the introductions at the minute, and just in a second, I'm going to start off the night by introducing you to the planning system. Some of you may be really experienced with the planning system, others may not know anything. So we're going to take it steady, and we're going to just gently introduce what the planning system is to begin with. Dan's then going to take over and talk to you in a bit more detail about the National Planning Policy Framework, what that is and why it's important, and also highlight some other changes that have been brought in by the government recently since they came into power. Then we'll hand over to colleagues at Renew EV, who are going to take you through hopefully some interesting case studies focusing on onshore wind and rooftop solar. And then we've got time available for questions. And we'll aim to finish at the very latest by 8:30. Just some housekeeping before we get going. Please feel free to turn on your camera and write in the box just who you are. It's always nice to see people's faces. But please, could you keep yourself muted whilst the presentations are going? Please feel free to use the chat box to post any questions as we go along. Lucy's going to be monitoring the chat box, and I know some of you have already posted some questions in advance. But when we get to the question and answer session, please could you use the raise hand function just so it helps us pick who speaks next. I think that's the housekeeping out of the way. So on just to the first part of the webinar then, an introduction to the planning system. And I wanted just to start off by just sort of outlining what the planning system is, and really what people who've experienced the planning system might think of what the planning system is, might actually be a bit bigger than that. So actually there's a series of different legal regimes that actually make up the planning system. We'll go through what they are. We've got the town and country planning regime, which applies controls to the development of nearly all land in the UK. And the English system's sort of framed by different acts of Parliament. And this is the main part of the planning system that most planning proposals or things go through. But there are others to be aware of. We've got building regulations, which is like a separate framework based on the Building Act. And that's more focused on technical and safety standards of buildings. And just to be aware of things like the Future Home Standard, which we're going to come in at some point soon, will likely require new homes, for example, to include rooftop solar PV. We've got the nationally significant infrastructure planning regime as well. This is a separate thing to the town and country planning system, introduced in 2008. It's centralised. It's a powerful sort of legislative tool for large-scale projects, and these things get decided directly by the government, by the Secretary of State, rather than local authorities. Generally speaking, they're for schemes that are over 50 megawatts, big schemes. But at the moment, it doesn't include wind, it doesn't include battery storage. And then finally, there's the marine planning regime as well, another separate legal framework. And these are a system which has development rights for terrestrial water owned by the Crown Estate. So that's for things like offshore wind turbines. So lots of different legal regimes. The one we're most interested in, and the one we'll be focusing on tonight, is the town and country planning system. And in a nutshell, basically what this does is that it requires landowners to submit a planning application to carry out any development. The system's plan-led, so any decisions to grant planning permission are based upon policies in local development plans produced by local councils, local authorities, and also national policy produced by the government. And district unitary authorities are responsible for the preparation of those local plans and deciding planning applications. The government are the ones that set the sort of regulatory and policy framework for the control and development of plan making through things like the National Planning Policy Framework, which we'll take you through in a second, and other guidance like National Planning Practice Guidance, National Design Guide, and lots of others. And there are really several key actors involved in this. So we've got local authorities. They're the ones, as I said, that make the plans and decide planning applications, whether to grant or refuse planning permission. We've got the planning inspectorate. They're the ones who independently examine local plans, but also sort of arbitrate on appeals. We've got the Ministry for Homes, Communities and Local Government. They're the government department who are responsible for planning. Statutory consultees. So, for example, like Historic England, Dan's going to say a little bit about them in a second as well. And then we've got the private sector, and you could consider that to basically mean anyone who's going to put in a planning application to build something. So lots of different actors. And just to note that, just to confuse things, that actually some development is permitted development. It doesn't need planning applications at all. So, for example, solar panels on domestic roofs under 50 kilowatt quite often won't require planning permission at all. So that's a very brief overview of the planning system or systems. Why is it important? The system plays a critical role in identifying what development is needed and where, what areas need to be protected or enhanced, and in assessing whether proposed development is suitable or not. It's a really powerful tool, and it's there for a really specific and important purpose. One of the purposes, if you're ever going to interact with the planning system, maybe it's to do with your own house. The most common way that you're going to experience it is putting in a planning application for something. And just to take people through a simple process of what that means in practice, we've got a little flow chart here. It starts off with you submitting an application for something to build something. That goes to the local planning authority, and they will look at it to see whether that application is valid on receipt. If it is, the application is registered and you're good to go. The process has started. If it's not, you might require additional information, and you're going to have to provide that to the local planning authority before they validate it. Assuming it's all good, the local planning authority will spend 21 days, or at least 21 days, consulting on your application to get the views of local people, businesses, any other interested bodies. They might do a site visit to have a look at your site, the land that's going to be developed. And eventually that application will be considered by the council. It could be by a planning officer, or it could go to planning committee if it's contentious. If the decision's made, or the decision has to be made within a time limit. If it's not, you've got the right to appeal to the planning inspectorate. If it is, then it's either going to be refused or permitted. If it's refused, you've got choices to make. You can revise the application and resubmit, in which case you have to start all over again. Or you can appeal. If you think the local planning authority's got it wrong, you can appeal to the planning inspectorate, who will independently review and make a decision. If you're lucky, everything's gone your way, you'll get granted planning permission. Sometimes that'll be granted without conditions, but more likely it'll be granted with conditions. And what that means is that you'll be granted planning permission on the basis that you're going to go on and do something. So it could be, for example, you'll get permission, but you have to build the thing you want to build out of the certain type of materials, or it could be you're allowed to do it, but on the basis that you also implement a landscape enhancement scheme or something like that. But those conditions will be specified. And once they're discharged, then you can finally get think about building the thing. So that's a basic process about how the planning application process works. Of course, the important thing, or one of the key bits along there, is how the planning authority makes a decision. As I said at the beginning, the system's plan-led. So planning decisions made by the council must accord with the relevant development plan, usually called a local plan, unless there are material considerations of sufficient weight to indicate a decision otherwise. So the local plan's really, really important. It's key policy making tool in your area that the local planning authority will use to determine your planning application. Material considerations are varied and wide ranging, but they should serve or be related to the purpose of planning, i.e. the development and use of land, and they should fairly and reasonably relate to the application. One such material consideration will be whether the plan policies are relevant and up to date. And it's fair to say quite a lot of local plans around the country are quite old, and some of their policies are out of date. But in making a decision, national planning policy framework must be taken into account in preparing the local plan, and it's the most important, I would say, material consideration out there. And we'll go through the NPPF in just a second. Just a quick diagram here to see how these plans fit together, because there are different plans that fit in different levels. The NPPF sits at the top. It covers the whole of England, and I think Dan would describe it as being the Bible for planners. It sets out what local councils should plan for, what its priorities are, what priorities given to different objectives. So, for example, plans could give high priority to climate change, for example. They have the power to do that. So the NPPF sets that sort of context for every local authority produces its local plan. So the local plan covers your council area, and that is the main document that local planning authority officers will use to determine your planning application against. It must be in accordance with the NPPF. And then at the bottom level, and this is a sort of optional level, not everywhere has one, but a lot of areas do, are neighbourhood plans that cover like commonly will cover like a parish area, for example. Once they're adopted, though, they do have the same power as local plans, so they can be a very powerful thing to have in your local community. Final slide from me. Why does this matter to me? Well, all renewable energy projects will inevitably involve at some point and to some degree the development of land, at which point the planning system needs to be on your radar about something to think about. Some schemes might not need planning permission, so they'll be fine, but a lot will. Anything big that maybe you might be part of a community energy group, maybe you're thinking or have brought projects forward, planning system's going to get involved at some point. And that system can either be a barrier or an enabler to achieving your aim. So it's something you need to really think about. So I think that's the end for me. That's a really quick canter through the planning system. And I'm just going to pass over to my colleague Dan now to talk a bit more about the National Planning Policy Framework and some of those wider policy changes that are being brought in by the government. So over to you, Dan.
Okay, that's great. So yeah, as Neil says, I'll be talking through the NPPF and all the kind of wider policy changes. And I'm going to start big and then work in. So I'm starting at the kind of just general policy changes from the Labour government's come in. So prominent within their manifesto was their clean energy mission, which was to make the UK a clean energy superpower with zero carbon electricity by 2030. And that's a very ambitious ask. And that's sort of basically saying the future is renewable. And that sets the context for the kind of the Labour government's changes to the planning system, which is setting a very much more kind of prominent, much greater importance to renewables. But before we get on to that, so we've got the manifesto promised the creation of GB Energy, which would be a publicly owned clean generation company, capitalised to the tune of 8.3 billion. And this would partner with communities around the country and local authorities to generate 8 gigawatts of clean power by 2030. Again, a sort of incredible target, basically. And then within that is the sort of local power plan, which is how they plan to sort of to sort of join up with communities in order to deliver on that. And also there's objectives to kind of triple solar power to 50 gigawatts in that same time frame, and double our onshore wind capacity to 35 gigawatts within that same time frame. So that's all to the good, really. And then next slide, please, Neil. And that sets the sort of and then obviously scaling up community energy, making funding available for local authorities and low interest loans of £400 million per year for communities to access. And we've had the reopening of the Community Energy Fund. I'm hoping that's going to be a permanent fixture now. And then the government has put great importance on the need to sort of accelerate grid deployment. So essentially what we've got, the electricity system, both the kind of large transmission pylons you see marching across the countryside and the local distribution grid that provide power into people's homes, was sort of designed to serve a largely kind of linear electricity system, which would take energy from distant power stations in the regions and transmit it to people's homes. And obviously how it's used now is totally different than that. We've had huge growth of renewables and electric vehicles, and so the demands on the grid have absolutely grown beyond any recognition before. And the grid is being used in different ways to what it was designed to do. And so in large portions of the country, it's totally at capacity, meaning that new renewable energy cannot connect or is given lead times of up to 10 to 15 years to connect to the system, which is obviously not very helpful. And so the problem is that to date, grid reinforcement has happened reactively and in a piecemeal fashion in response to proposals for developers. But last year, the government carried out a review of the transmission and distribution systems and how they're planned to be reinforced. And reforms are currently going through to make that grid reinforcement happen ahead of need in a much more proactive sort of joined up way to really reduce those delays and costs, basically. So that's all the context around it. And then next slide, please, Neil. And then just sort of looking at the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, which, as Neil said, is the Bible for planners. We actually have quite a centralised planning system in the UK. So local authorities write their local plans, fair enough, but they have to do so in general accordance with what's set out in the NPPF. So if the government changes national planning policy, that then filters down through local plans and planning decisions to actually what happens on the ground, basically. So it's hugely important, basically. So there was a consultation which just closed last week from the Labour government, and these slides include the changes. And so the crossed out bits are crossed out in the text, and the red bits are new, basically. And so here, paragraph B, it may seem like a minor change, but it's going from saying the local authorities should consider identifying suitable areas for renewables to that they should identify suitable areas. So that's positive. So it's basically the government taking renewable energy much more seriously and requiring councils to do so as well. And then over the page again, please, Neil. And then this is new text. Local authorities should support planning applications for all forms of renewable and low carbon development. So it's very strongly supportive of renewables. And then later on, it should give significant weight to the proposal's contribution to renewable energy generation and a net zero future. So again, we're sort of changing the balance of the different things that we're trying to achieve through the planning system. And so if you've got a planning application that has some harm, but is generating renewable energy, now we're sort of pushing down on that side of the scale, saying, okay, we need to give significant weight to the benefits of renewable energy in terms of kind of decarbonisation of our net zero future. So it's positive. And the next slide, please, Neil. And then this is all deleted text, and you don't need to go through it in detail. But if you remember back in 2015, the then Conservative government brought in basically a de facto ban on onshore wind. And so from that point until just now, in order to get planning permission for a wind turbine, you could only get planning permission if it was in an area that had previously been identified as being suitable for onshore wind in a council's local plan or in a neighbourhood plan, basically. And also there was other text saying that planning impacts had to be addressed and the proposal had to have community support. And so that led to only about 10% of local authorities had actually identified suitable areas for onshore wind to be developed. And so it amounted to more or less a de facto ban on onshore wind in most parts of the country, basically. Now, all of that has gone. This is all now deleted. I could have crossed it through, but it would have made it more difficult to read. And so that's all gone. And so now there's a kind of level playing field between onshore wind applications for onshore wind and any other kind of application. So now you can just lodge a planning application or an environmental impact assessment, a planning application with an environmental impact assessment in the same way as any other form of development, basically. So that's highly significant. And essentially we've restarted the wind industry in England, basically, by doing this. And then next slide, please. And then sort of backing out of renewables and now starting to look at kind of historic England. Historic England have just recently published quite a significant advice note, adapting historic buildings for energy and carbon efficiency, signalling a much more positive approach to kind of proposals to retrofit those buildings and incorporate renewable energy within historic and listed buildings, basically. Next slide, please. And so there's now a kind of much more structured assessment approach, weighing harms to listed building and other harms and the benefits from retrofitting proposals and renewables, including energy efficiency gains and carbon reduction. And for kind of conservation officers in historic England, this is venturing into new ground, basically, because conservation officers tend to think about just the listed building. It's like, I'm just thinking about the protection of the listed building because of course it's their job description, it's what they're trained to do. I'm not going to think about anything else. Don't tell me about climate, I'm just thinking about the listed building. And now this is indicating a more positive response, basically, that they will start to take into account the benefits of a proposal in terms of climate mitigation, as well as the harms, basically. So it's really positive. And then next slide, please. And so we've got greater support for renewables on listed buildings and historic buildings, and talking about kind of the installation of PV and solar thermal panels will be acceptable if they're generally hidden from view, if they're on roof slopes of less prominence, even if they would be visible, and low carbon heating systems will generally be acceptable. So it's all quite positive. And again, it's sort of, it means that for kind of community energy organizations that have maybe feared to do anything to listed buildings and feared to get into that area, maybe this is kind of starting to make that a bit more possible, a bit more doable. The next slide, please. And yeah, just going on, greater support for EV charging, for insulation, for window improvements, including things like slim line double glazing within existing frames. So it's just sort of, I think previously my sense of it was that kind of conservation officers and historically were perhaps a little bit absolutist. I think this is kind of taking a more kind of a more positive, proactive approach, and it's really positive. And next slide again, please. Oh, and then that's the end for me. So I've kind of finished talking now. So I think, is it you, John? Talking now.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll just introduce, thanks very much, Dan. Yeah, pass it on to we've got two Johns. So John Rawlins, I think, first to maybe introduce Renew EV and onto rooftop solar. Over to you, John.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. So I've only got 4 slides tonight, so hoping it's going to be a bit more chatty. And I can take questions through the chat as we go, or just save it all up for the end. That's fine by me. Quickly on Renew EV, we'll start there. Then I'll talk about the process of community rooftop solar, then what makes a good site, and then a little bit on what's really working in the market at the moment. And there's not going to be that much in relation to planning. I know this is quite planning focused. I think John Malone will talk much more about planning for wind, but as Neil mentioned, actually planning in the rooftop concept is quite straightforward. So it shouldn't be too difficult. So Renew EV, we started in 2019. Originally, the name was Renewable Technology and Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure Consultants. It was way too long. So we pushed it down to Renew EV, which means it doesn't really make sense to anyone. We do a little bit of EV work, but actually about 1/3 of our work is supporting community energy groups up and down the country. We go as far north as Grimsby, as far south as the Isles of Scilly, a little bit over in Wales, and over towards Test Source, which is Hampshire way as well. But close to home, we have some retained clients where we have effectively, they've outsourced their asset development. So we go out and find new sites for them. And I'm going to talk through that process next, and what to look out for and avoid as we go. So Neil, next slide, please. So through that colourful wheel, starting on the top right, you can see where it all begins in the search, and then it wheels itself around through the site assessment, financial modelling, the proposal, legal, pre-construction and commissioning. On the search side of things, community energy groups in themselves are quite restricted by boundaries. They're quite geographically constrained. So you might find a perfect site just outside of the boundary, but you tend to sort of leave that for them. There are, of course, DNO constraints that you have. So that's the distribution network. It's not so bad, actually, with rooftop on the constraints. It's pretty easy to get around that through export limitation schemes. And the G99 regulations, actually, you can pretty much max the export to the import rating now of the site. There is still a slight niggle around having batteries there at the same time. If you do have batteries, they look at that as a generation technology. So if you had a 50 kilowatt battery and a 50 kilowatt solar PV, they'd look at that as 100. Not that you'd ever choose to do that. If one was going, you'd charge it up and you'd use the other at night, but they have to look at it that way. But it is getting much easier to find. And I'll go into more about what you're looking for late in the next slide, but search really starts on Google Maps. It's just looking around, what do we think is going to work? Find a good roof, find a warm connection, a good lead, where you can go have a conversation with someone about the benefits of rooftop solar. The site assessment itself, we're looking out for poor roof conditions. It might look great on Google, and then sometimes you get there and the building's gone and things like that. But you want to make sure that you've got a roof that is likely to withstand the 25 years or more that solar is going to be in place. So end of life roofs aren't particularly good, but you can have a conversation about repair and replace of that roof. And if they've got a schedule of repair and replace, you might time that proposal to work with it. In terms of the planning considerations, so in terms of it was mentioned before by Neil that anything under 50 was permitted development, and it used to be the case that everything above 50 was a full planning permission. They moved that up to 1 megawatts for full planning, and everyone thought, great, it's going to go from 50 kilowatts to 1 megawatts as permitted development, but actually it's not. and some people do get caught out, between 50 and 1 meg, you have to go for prior approval, which is effectively just demonstrating that you've read the rule book and you're going to comply to what the permitted development rules are. So they're pretty straightforward. Stay 1 metre from the edge. Don't protrude more than 20 centimetres on a pitched roof, more than 1 metre on a flat roof, which I think is incredibly generous, but I think it harks back to the days of barrel drum mounting rather than the kind of aluminium framing that we have now. But they should all get way through. Now, there will be some context, such as AONB or conservation areas, and so on and so forth, where you have to think much more carefully about that application. We've done it on in the curtilage of Grade 1 listed buildings, and we've made it work. It does become more expensive as a result of that. We've engaged with proper planning consultants, listed buildings consultants, things like that. But it can definitely happen. You just have to find a site that is going to be sufficiently valuable to make the community energy model work, because it's going to absorb a lot of cost and therefore benefit through those fees. Yeah, I'd hope with the changes in planning, it becomes a little bit easier and we don't need that really expert edge to try and get the planning permission through. But I've not tested it yet in the new sort of planning psyche, but we'll see how we get. On the site assessment, we then move on to the financial model. So if we think it's going to work, we'll quickly model the finances for it, make sure that it works for all parties. For those not familiar with community energy, we raise money effectively crowdsourced from the area preferably, which will install panels or any renewable energy type. And though the electricity that's generated is sold back to the site at a price that is always, or at least generally, lower than they can buy from the grid. And that means it's a sort of a zero investment for the site, and they will always benefit from the electricity that's generated there. That's all summarised in a proposal. Some people might call that heads of terms. Heads of terms is a little heavy for a top proposal. It's usually just sort of 2 or 3 sides. And if that's accepted, we then go into the legal phase. And the legal phase can take forever. I don't know why. It just seems to drag and drag and drag. Find yourself, if you can, a really good solicitor who understands community energy and really understands physics, electricity, how things work, because you will find that sometimes it's a real education to try and get people to understand how it's all going to work and where the energy will flow and be used and not used. So if anyone wants recommendations, by all means get in touch. There are some really good ones out there. Then pre-construction, you're in the home run now, assuming everything's been signed. Do make sure that you have someone to take responsibility of the asset once it's in. There are community asset managers out there like Bright Renewables who will look after that asset for you. It's really important that it's onboarded well and that the site has a point of contact, because after we've gone to commissioning, it's then straight back to search. You're out finding your next thing, and if you're bogged down in some of the sort of the teething issues or the billing issues or that sort of thing, it will really make a very lumpy delivery pipeline for all your assets. So it's important to work across all of these at the same time to keep a steady flow. What we found is that you need, if you want to deliver about 1 megawatt, you need about 2 megawatts of kind of active pipeline to make that happen. It's kind of a 2-to-1 relationship. In the last 2 years, we've delivered 2 megawatts for Bathurst Community Energy, about 300 for Avalon Community Energy, and we should break 1 megawatt of rooftop solar for Bristol Energy Cooperative by Christmas, which is quite exciting. And this is all in the sort of the post-FIT era. So for a while, rooftop solar kind of disappeared from the community energy world, but we found a new way of doing it, which means that everybody benefits and we can make it work. Next slide, please. So what makes a good site? There's lots of things, but broadly speaking, you need these 4 to make it work. You need a good roof, and that's sort of pretty obvious. But you need a good roof. It doesn't have to be south-facing. I think there's this assumption that south is great. And in terms of maximum generation, yes, it is. But if you have a 5-degree north-facing roof, that will still work quite well. The angle of sort of incidence onto solar panels now doesn't have to be 90 degrees. You know, the panels have got really good. And also east-west can much better match the consumption of the site as well. So it will catch that first sun and that last sun of the day as well. So you get a slightly more bulgy generation, with not quite so much peak, but you'll potentially sell more energy to the site than you will have it exporting. Which brings on to site consumption. It's no good having a fantastic roof if you can't actually sell it to anyone. We still can't sell to the grid at a rate that really makes it work. You can get some premiums being associated to a community energy group, and there is lots of work trying to make local supply work as well, where you kind of sell it to your neighbour. But that's not sort of mass market yet. So you really do need to rely on the site taking the energy. So something like a big refrigeration warehouse is ideal. They're going to use all of the electricity that's there, and you can very confidently predict what their consumption will be like. Also, capex constrained. It sounds pretty obvious, but places like schools, they don't have any money to spend on stuff like this, but they do want to make investments towards a greener future and to save money. That said, there could be some commercial organisations which have the money, and the argument there is, well, what else could you spend it on? Would they sell it on sales, marketing, product development? Because there are lots of very suitable sites where they just haven't done it. So actually, why don't we let? So Lynn Jones, capex is capital expenditure. So it's the money that you spend as a business on stuff that's there rather than just operating expenses. So if they schools very capex constrained, whereas some businesses aren't, but they're spending the money on other stuff. And one of the things that we offer is that after a period of time, if they want to buy it off the community energy group, then they're welcome to do that. Actually, our mission is about decarbonisation, not necessarily owning the biggest amount of solar. So that would work as well. We can get it up there, let it run for a bit, and then when they have the money, they can take it off us. But we found that's not really necessary because, like I said, there's always a call on their cash to spend it on something else. And then the other thing is local and empowered decision making. You look at the big roofs of, I don't know, Tesco or Sainsbury's or something like that, and it would be an ideal site for solar. They'd use every single last drop of it. But actually trying to get traction with an organisation like that is quite hard. So if you can find local businesses that are kind of family owned, that kind of thing, they're really really good targets to go after. So if you've got all those 4 variables on a particular site, you're onto a pretty good run with those. Next slide, please. So why now? Why is it really working? So really low install costs at the moment. So we're looking at a good site will have anything between £700 and £900 per kilowatt for an installation, which by historical standards is crazy cheap. Also, the high energy prices of the last couple of years have really focused the mind on why is my energy bill so high? What can I do about it? And because of the constrained capital budgets or the capex, there's very little wiggle room that they have. So actually coming along with that cash to make it happen is very welcome. And there's a number of examples of schools where we've saved tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds for schools across sort of the Bath area. And the sort of the tragic alternative is firing staff, which is obviously it's great that they don't have to do that, and we can decarbonise at the same time. What is the offer? We try and make it risk-free. That could be quite scary for a community energy group, but you have to remember that kind of the community energy group is the expert relative to the site, so you have to take a little bit more risk. And what that means is that what we find works well is we have a fixed discount on the prevailing rate. So if they're paying 25p per unit, we'll offer 10% off that, or 15% off, whatever the financial model tells us. But you also have a never pay more than. So should prices spike up again to 50, 60, 70 pence per kilowatt hour, it's not right, we felt, to profiteer from that. So we capped our prices at around the 20 pence mark. So the effective discount is much greater. The rub is if it does go down, say to 15p, we'd have to follow that down as well, taking 10% off and selling at 13.5. But it's really important, particularly with schools and any sort of charities, if they're taking on risk, they don't like that. And the Department for Education is not inclined to accept proposals where there would have been an opportunity for them to buy cheaper in the future. So if it was a fixed price rising at RPI, and in 5 years you could buy cheaper from the grid, they'd still have to pay for the expensive electricity. So we found that this walks through the Department for Education, and we've had approvals within 48 hours for our leases which go in, which is quite unprecedented. Also, the offer is managed for the duration of the lease. I go to lots of schools which have solar. It's gone up, but it's disconnected or soiled or whatever. It's just not working. But obviously, the Community Energy Group will manage this through its life, and it is modest savings. It's not massive savings in absolute money, and they would always be better off making the investment themselves. And we always say that up front. But actually, for zero investment, it's a pretty good return, and it does deliver an agency in delivering net zero. So that's kind of everything that I was going to say. I think that's about 10 minutes. Do I take questions now, Neil, or do you want to take questions at the end?
I think we'll, yeah, thanks, John. I think we'll take questions at the end.
Cool.
Hopefully, I've seen there's lots of, I can't see the questions from my end, but I can see the numbers. I think they're racking up. I think Lucy is keeping an eye on those. But I think we'll go on. Hopefully, John Malone has joined. I think I'll let him in.
Yeah, he's there.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Can you
Cool.
Can you hear me, Neil?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Hi,
good.
John.
Thank you. Okay. Right.
Yeah, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, John Rawlins, handing over to me. Yeah. So just to follow on, very brief introduction from me. I joined Renew EV back in the summer, a few months ago. I joined having worked in community energy since 2007 with Energy for All, and back then I have been involved in a number of community single wind turbine and other wind turbine projects that sort of progressed through planning before the effective ban came in that Dan was talking about earlier. So I'm just going to talk through just to give you a sense of what some of the key considerations might be for a wind project, and then just to give a few examples, which hopefully will lead on to some discussion and some Q&A a little bit later. So I'll probably not overdo the presentation now, and then hopefully we can have a discussion on points of interest once we're through the presentation. So yeah, what I'm talking about is trying to get from this prime wind turbine site, empty field, through to the community energy organisation looking to raise money through its share offer, so that it can go on and build the energy generating asset. So that is quite a process, and obviously the groups that you're involved with need to be aware of what they're getting into. Can I have the next slide, please? I don't know who's controlling the slide. So, and the initial considerations that need to be thought through just before serious progress starts is to think about, if you are considering a site, is it a site on which you can secure the land? In other words, can you agree with the landowner that their site will be offered for a community energy project? Is the landowner keen to do that, supportive of that, and ultimately can they see a benefit to them in some kind of commercial arrangement with the community energy organisation? Does the site have reasonable access? And there I'm thinking about actual physical access from the public highway for delivery of what are very large components when considering building a single wind turbine or larger project. But also, is that access across the landowner's land, or will other landowners need to be involved? So how do you get to the site from the public highway as well? To make the site a reality, you're going to need a grid offer. Is the capacity there? on the grid, and have you been engaged with the grid such that there is a grid offer that is being processed or will be made? And also then to think about where will the development funding come from to take your project through the planning process. And at the moment, we have the opportunity as community groups through the Community Energy Fund, and there is much talk about further funding coming through local authorities and to community energy groups. So in this optimistic world that we're now in, there is considerable hope that there will be funding to support communities who want to try and deliver these kind of projects. And then just moving on, please. So in terms of brevity and prompting discussion, I just wanted to identify some of the key planning considerations. There's a much much longer and extended list of what needs to be thought through. But in the first instance, these are some of the key aspects that will need to be considered, and some of the more costly elements that might need to be built into your project plan. So ecology, landscape and visual impact, and nearest properties can help you to think initially about whether your site has potential for a wind energy project. Ecology, I'm thinking about, are there hedgerows? Will there be bats? What is the bird life like on the site? There may be other considerations around invertebrates and so on that will need to be eventually assessed through surveys. But an initial view from an ecologist can help to inform a group whether their site has the potential to be developed. Clearly, for wind energy, landscape and visual impact is going to be a key consideration. There's quite an art to considering what impact a single or multiple turbines will have on the landscape, and what the visual impact of those turbines will be across the area, particularly from key viewpoints such as footpaths, key areas of habitation, and so on. So again, an early considered view on that is invaluable. And obviously another key consideration is where are the nearest properties to the proposed site? What impact might a turbine have, as well as visually, on those properties in terms of noise and potential shadow flicker, both of which can be mitigated against, and steps can be taken to reduce those impacts. But they're serious considerations for progressing the project through the planning process. In order to start to think about those things and to understand where your local planning authority is coming from, then, if possible, informal engagement with the LPA would be helpful. I'm interested to hear what other people have to say about this. We are finding that informal conversation is a little bit more difficult as perhaps authorities are less well resourced, and actually entering into the pre-application process, which is slightly more formal. It's still confidential, but does actually incur a fee for the community energy group. That might be the way in to have a well-informed early discussion with the local planning authority. That's my experience. Neil, Dan, or some of the people on the call, on the meeting may have other experiences. I'm interested to hear what people have to say about that. To formalise the way ahead in planning, then you may want to go into seek a scoping and screening opinion from the local planning authority. That's a formal submission which makes the project publicly, puts the project into public domain. So again, that's a key step there, is thinking about how you will engage with the local community, and the scoping and screening opinion will set the scene for what information you need to provide when you submit your full planning application. And as I've just touched on there, a key consideration is how the group will manage community engagement. And again, that's possibly a topic for debate, as there are different views on, as community energy organisations, we want to be as engaged as possible and building a positive story around a project. But my experience, and again, it'd be interesting to hear what people have to say, is that wind will always polarize opinion in a community. So community engagement can lead to a considerable amount of work trying to manage that debate. So a judgment as to when to engage fully with local community needs to be taken, and needs to be informed about what kind of information you want to have, what kind of questions you feel you might need to answer. And some of those questions need a little bit of groundwork to get the information together. So there's a judgment to be made about community engagement and when to go ahead with that, I think. Next slide, please. And so just to throw in the fact that it is possible to get wind sites through planning. This is a couple of examples. This is construction on two single turbine projects that Energy for All were involved with. The picture at the beginning of us standing in an empty field, on the left hand side, it's starting to take shape with the foundations in place and the anchor can ready for the tower to go on. And then the right hand side is a sister project for the Four Winds Co-op, which was also an EWT single wind turbine project in South Yorkshire. Next slide, please. And then, obviously, once you've got planning and raised your funding, you can then go through the process of contracting to bring the turbines to site and to see the construction take place. Next one, please. And it's quite a complex business to build the project, but eventually, next slide, please, you reach the moment when you can lift the rotor into place and start to generate clean renewable energy for your local community. It can be a long haul, and there are many twists and turns and quite a lot of debates and discussions to be engaged with, but keep in mind the goal you're aiming for, which is clean, green, community-owned renewable energy. And yeah, so I'm happy to answer questions if they don't get answered in the discussion today, and perhaps Neil and Dan, we can help provide answers if they don't get covered today.
That's great. Thanks, John, or the Johns. Yeah, that was really interesting. Take through two quite different processes there, but it's really heartening to see actually stuff in wind turbines, that it can be done, and hopefully with the new relaxed or slightly relaxed, more positive rules that are coming in that Dan said, that we'll see more of this in action. So I'm going to stop sharing there because I want to see your faces, and we'll take this point for question and answer session. So Lucy, hopefully been monitoring the chat whilst I've been sharing my screen. Oh, you're on mute, Lucy.
Can I just pick up one of the questions whilst Lucy's going on that? Yeah. There was a question about permitted development, and I don't think we made the distinction between ground mount and rooftop. Ground mount, even at 1 kilowatt, needs to go for full planning permission. So you only get that sort of 50 kilowatt and under permitted development for rooftop structures. So the question was about an ice cream farm. And I would always start with the roof before you start bringing in anything else, because you can usually, in a farming environment, deliver more than what you need from the existing site that's already there.
Thanks, John. Lucy.
Yeah, sorry. Shall we start with the wind questions, because that was the last thing talked about, and then we can go back to the other ones. So we have a question from Terence O'Neill. What's the approximate capital cost for one wind turbine, and is there still difficulty in getting grid connections for new energy projects? So
yeah,
John gave a partial answer to that, didn't you, John Rawlins?
Yeah. So I'll defer to John Malone about the cost, but what and also getting the grid. But what I have seen is that there are pockets of smaller sites. I was thinking more like ground mount solar rather than wind, where they're too small for commercial developers to bother with. They're kind of hunting for kind of 20 megawatts and up, but actually pockets of 1, 2, 3 megawatts can work from a community energy perspective, because we've got slightly different interests. We're more interested in sort of the decarbonisation rather than the large financial return. So that was my take on it. But John, if you've got a response on the cost and anything else on the grid.
I think the on the cost, actually, it was a discussion that came up the other day, and John's touched on the sort of reduction we've seen in solar over the past 5 years or more. That's not really happened with wind, and my experience of the 2 turbines I've described there, Four Winds Co-op raised 3.4 million and borrowed 400,000 to build those 2 turbines. So nearly 4 million for 2 single turbines. There were some additional costs in that project because of the nature of the project, but we're still looking at prices around the £1.5 million for a 1 megawatt turbine, and that's kind of considered to be an installed cost. But in there are variables like what would the grid connection cost be, what is your site actually like, how long are the tracks, and so on. So, but a rule of thumb, I would say, of £1 million for the turbine. I'm talking about a single 1 megawatt wind turbine, and then 40% again for the sort of balance of plant costs. Very rule of thumb. But talk to suppliers like EWT, and you'll get a sense from them. I think they'd be willing to sort of give indicative numbers to get you started on thoughts of the financial model. Grid connection wise, without exception, when we've in my recent experience of wind opening up again, as Dan was saying earlier, anything above a megawatt is problematic for the grid, and we're being told that the lead times for connection are extremely long, because that has an impact not only on the local grid, but the work needs to be done at transmission level to connect higher capacity than 1 megawatt. There seems to be a cutoff that the grid companies are working to at the moment. So, but for a single turbine, we are getting 1 megawatt and lower connections offered at not unreasonable cost, depending on where the particular local circumstances. So that's kind of the cutoff: 1 megawatt and lower, and you probably get a connection offer.
Is that uniform across the country, John, in terms of that? Or is it?
Yeah, well, bring just pre-Renew EV experience, there was definitely that kind of number, even 500 kilowatts in one example I can think of. So the 500 kilowatts to 1 megawatt was becoming a sort of standard response from more than the 2 grid organizations I'm currently liaising with, thinking about Northern Power Grid, when is the example the other example I can share, where that kind of limit was being applied. But I haven't got I've not got a blanket answer. I don't know whether that's completely standard across. That's just my experience of 3 different DNOs.
Okay, next question on wind. Dan had a question actually. I wondered whether many public sector planners are actually pretty ignorant of onshore wind. They've barely had to think about it or be faced with any applications for almost a decade. Have you seen that?
I think we've had honest comments from planning officers to exactly that effect. This is new to me. We're going to have to work at this together. Yeah, so I think there's a bit of a time to learn and get back up to speed on what is required to consider a wind turbine application. Again, I'm talking about quite a limited sample size so far, but that is a genuine concern, I think.
And last question on wind for the moment. Has there been much, if any, experience of urban wind?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the short answer is no. I think the examples I gave and that I've been involved with have been at a distance from local, necessarily at a distance from local residents, and more rural or on the edge of residential areas, if you like. So if somebody's talking there about a project very much in the built environment, then there's still a consideration about how far away residential properties are from any development. But But if it's industrial, then it's not out of the question. And I've not been involved with, but clearly there has been a number of projects where an industrial organisation with land has invested or worked with communities to deliver wind farms close to their factories or their buildings. So it's not out of the question, and could be looked at. But think about residential properties, and think about also what the wind resource might be, how big the turbine is in relation to the buildings, because the urban wind resource becomes much more turbulent, disrupted, and difficult to predict than cleaner airflows out in less out in the rural areas, if you like. So there are other considerations when you approach an urban wind project, but it's definitely happening in terms of organisations wanting to supply their own needs and building turbines near their own properties.
If we move on to the solar questions then.
Well, should we, so just before we move on, I was just thinking, does anyone else have any questions around wind? If you want to put your hands up before we move on. Nope. Okay. Should we move on, Lucy? Thanks.
Okay. So Barbara Craven asked about the problem needing three-phase electricity for larger number of solar panels, which is not subsidised as opposed to other countries. Again, John put some answers in the chat on that, but do you want to say a word?
Yeah, sure. I'll just kind of reiterate over it. So we've done the occasional single phase site, but normally what you need to have is significant consumption. And if there's significant consumption at the site, they've inevitably moved to a three-phase supply anyway. The rough rule of thumb is about 6,000 kilowatt hours per month is kind of the model where community solar will start to pay back. So that is, think about a smallish secondary school. It's that kind of size. So something like a community centre, it wouldn't have the demand to make the financial model work. It's kind of discounted before it gets there, really, because you're not going to have the consumption to make the model work.
Okay, the next question was about what max panels can you have within curtilage, thinking about agricultural buildings?
Yeah, so I think this was tied into the permitted development question. So they were thinking about how big they could go on the ground. It used to be people used to sort of throw in some pretty quick stuff in an agricultural setting, but it's now full planning permission. So it's much easier to go for the existing barns that are there, and then have an off-taker. The specific chat talk to the problem of, if you think of a very traditional dairy, they'll use energy early in the morning and they'll use energy towards the sort of afternoon, but there's not much used in the middle, which is exactly sort of the wrong type of profile that you need for using solar generation. But if you have something like ice builders or pasteurization for ice cream and things like that, or refrigeration units, then you will have a much more steady and predictable energy consumption. In that instance, you can make it work. It wouldn't necessarily work from a community energy perspective because it might not be quite big enough. But from a personal or kind of commercial investment, the business cases are usually quite strong for that. And you can introduce batteries as well to try and take advantage of effectively harvesting the sun from the day and then use it into the evening. And if you have a day-night tariff, you can arbitrage that night rate into the morning. So you charge up cheaply and then discharge it in the day. It does get quite fiddly quite quickly, and the optimization of the battery size, its power, the solar size, how that's optimized is quite a delicate art. So it's not the sort of thing you can just say, it'll work. But that's one of the services we do offer to try and help people understand that.
Is there any more questions on solar? I don't see anything else in the chat.
There's one that's just got from Robina Hetherington about looking at a landfill site for a solar farm.
Yeah.
Is it a waste of money to go for a pre-app? Should we go full? Or what is scope of screening? It's quite a, we've had a discussion on this internally recently. It's quite a challenging build on a landfill site. Obviously, you think about kind of no one should really be that bothered because the landfill site is just, it's a landfill site, so aesthetically it's already pretty rubbish. But actually doing the groundworks on something like a landfill site is quite challenging. So I would get a technical assessment before you proceed with a planning application, be it a pre-app or not, because you might find that that's a non-starter. But maybe you found a way to do it. I'm getting a lot of nods from Dan and a hand up.
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree, because it's the sort of thing that like in terms of visual impact, it may be acceptable, but obviously landfill sites themselves give rise to kind of leachates and all sorts of kind of potential environmental impacts in terms of sort of groundwater and you name it, basically. And so if I was a planner looking at that, I'd be thinking, oh, what's going to happen? How are the works to install the solar farm going to affect the ground conditions within the landfill site, basically? So I just agree. Yeah, go for a pre-app opinion.
Except that we've got funding for a feasibility study, or we're on the cusp of it, which includes a chunk of money for pre-app and also the geotechnic stuff. And I just find myself thinking, why not just go for full if we're going to go for pre-app?
Yeah, I mean, if you have the money, you can. It's difficult to argue against it, and you can't spend it on anything else. So you could find out, and actually, with that grant money, there probably comes some obligation to share that knowledge. So once you share that knowledge, that kind of everyone benefits from that. So in which case, if you have the money, go for it.
Go for full.
If you've got the money, why not?
Well, is the cost of full much the same as pre-app? Because pre-app was daft expensive because it's based on the area. So it came out at quite a large amount of money.
You take this one, Dan, if it's a planning question.
Well, I was just thinking, if you were thinking about how to do that in a more cheap way without having to go in for a full pre-app, you could approach the Environment Agency, because they would be a consultee looking at issues like sort of what's the impact of this going to be on groundwater, and just approach them in that way. And I don't know, they might just
got the money for the pre-app.
Yeah, I think if it were me, I'd do a pre-app, but
I think, yeah, I pretty agree with Dan. It's probably less risky on your behalf, because if you went in for a pre-app, you'd be informed by the council, not only as towards like the acceptability of the scheme broadly, but also you'll probably get a heads up around what information you might need to submit with a planning application, and access probably to some statutory quantities as well. So I guess if you, like John said, if you've got the money, brilliant, you could go to full, but you might that application might be more streamlined or successful if you went for a pre-app. There's pros and cons, I guess. Has anyone else who's on the call got a view on that in terms of pre-apps versus full applications? Any experience? Alex Radley says, I'd always do pre-app. Yep. Okay. Thank you, Alex.
Hi, just to supplement that, I used to work, I'm not a planner, but I used to work for a planning consultancy on things exactly like this, on landfills, wind farms, marinas, flood defences, that sort of thing. I can honestly say that I don't think the pre-app money was ever wasted. At the very least, it helps you to establish some sort of relationship with the planning authority. It means that your application doesn't come as a bolt out the blue. They're sort of warmed up to it already. And that's the least you could expect. I think, as I think it was Neil said, or maybe it was one of the Johns, I can't remember, I'm sorry. You know, it should help to flush out a lot of the issues and a lot of the concerns. And you may get information if you get a face-to-face meeting that they may not be 100% happy at putting in writing, but it's nonetheless useful to know sort of background information or views and opinions, that sort of thing. I think it's well worth it, and it can, if you can use it also to cut down the number of topics that you have to assess in your environmental impact assessment, that can save you a huge amount of time and money and complication later on.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Alex. That was really helpful. Lucy.
Okay. Another wind question just came in. So if we just take that one and then maybe perhaps move on to the planning questions for Dan. So got, does a small wind project, just 1 or 2 turbines, stack up financially without a specific off-taker, i.e. by just exporting it into the grid? That's from Molly Woods.
I think that's a very good question, because I think you've got to approach that with with your eyes wide open, because it might be quite challenging, and obviously the unknown thing is what energy prices are going to do if you're trying to plan a 25-30 year project. So the answer is be careful, because it's not clear that without an off-taker you will have a viable project. We've got very excited in the past few years because energy prices shot up, and it all looked it looked as though sites would suddenly be unlocked that weren't financially viable. But clearly you can't build a 25-year model on spikes in the short-term spikes in the energy prices. So I think it's a valid question that needs careful consideration when you're looking whether to get to commit serious funds to developing your project. So ideally, off-taker gives you more certainty. The whole market is in some flux, however, and talk of local energy supply and ways of improving the income to projects, whether governments are going to give any support through, as we had with the feed-in tariff. All that is I think is open for discussion at the moment, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in the coming months and years. Obviously, there comes a point in a project development when you have to make a judgment about how much you can commit. But I think keeping a project moving at this stage, if possible, is very sensible, because hopefully we will see opportunities to develop. But I think it's a really key question alongside the planning issues. What would happen to the economic model in various scenarios?
Okay. Shall we move on to questions for Dan then? Planning questions?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so there was a general question with lots of add-ons from different people. So how much will the national policy changes impact on restrictions in conservation areas or areas of outstanding natural beauty, national parks and the green belt?
Yeah, fair enough. So basically what we've seen is the NPPF has carried out changes to the kind of renewable energy policy, but hasn't really changed any of the policy about AONBs or national parks. And so we still have presumption against more than major development in those landscape designations. And renewable energy is also seen as being inappropriate within the green belt. However, kind of determining a planning application is often a kind of weighing up of benefits and disbenefits, basically. And so you might have a project that isn't fully in compliance with national planning policy in every respect, and you're sort of weighing up, well, it delivers all this benefit in terms of renewable energy, and we say that's important, and it causes a bit of harm in these respects, basically. And so the fact that you're now giving more weight to the benefits of renewables in terms of climate change means that you might have decisions proposals getting consent in those kind of locations that you wouldn't have got consent for before. But in terms of the actual text, what it says about those development in those designations, there's no change. Do you see what I mean? Hope that makes sense. And then there were the questions about restrictions in conservation areas. I wasn't quite sure whether that was a question about the revised guidance from Historic England. I think maybe it was. And so I think the same there. It's sort of showing a more positive slightly more permissive stance from historic England that is likely to kind of filter down through to conservation areas in terms of kind of weighing up the benefits and harms a bit more robustly and giving a little bit more weight to the benefits in terms of renewables and climate change. I hope that answers your questions. And the Johns and Neil, I'd be interested to hear what you think.
It's a really good point, and it was one of the things that CSE made when we responded to that consultation, and some of you on the call may have made the same ones, to say that, you know, these changes in terms of the changes to the renewables policies, they're really, really good, they're great, but I think we think you should also look at the rest of the NPPF, update the green belt policy, have a look at things like the AONB policy, because we're concerned that there's still going to be a bit of a barrier and they're not going to enable the sort of scale and pace of change that we need. So we have highlighted that as an organisation, and you might have too, but that's a really good question.
Thanks for sharing that. I should have added that.
Yeah, you wrote it.
I wrote it, yeah.
Lucy?
Okay. Then there's I'm sure Liz Unsworth has raised a point. She says, new national landscape areas have communities living within them, and our electricity supply is at maximum, and any improvements to infrastructure is contested due to nature conservation and visual impact. Also, electricity companies are not interested in investment because no major housing development is permitted. So is there a question around that, Liz, or if you're there?
I'd make the comment that there's a difference between supply and generation. So whilst the supply might be at a maximum, there should be sufficient headroom to displace some of that through sort of targeted rooftop solar. So you might not be able to do very large ground mount schemes, but if you should be able to export at the same level that you import. So if you have a 100 amp connection coming in, a 3-phase 100 amp, you should be able to connect something pretty serious to that, depending on the consumption that you have on the site. So what you're doing in generating is you're easing up the pressure on that system coming in. So yeah, very challenging for something like massive ground mount solar or wind, but we could definitely try and find some suitably placed rooftop solar on there.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't get my thing to unmute. Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, we've got transport consultants at the moment looking at our area in Silverdale, which is part of Arnside and Silverdale National Landscape. And the major thing they seem to be coming up with is lack of electricity capacity, lack of grid capacity. And we are, you know, a visitor economy, but we cannot have EV chargers in the area, fast EV chargers, because the grid capacity can't take it. And as for, you know, putting solar panels on roofs, you know, our major viewpoints, you could say, in the national landscape here are quite high up. You're looking down on the village, and, you know, it's total visual impact. And it's all very well talking about historic England, but what about natural England? You know, what's their stance on it? You know, we're not talking, I mean, historic buildings is one thing, but a whole, you know, sort of natural landscape is another. So I would prefer really to know more about that. And thank you very much. It's been really interesting.
You're welcome. Yeah, I agree about natural England. I don't think I know their kind of latest policy position, so I probably can't advise you, I'm afraid. But yeah, I think the point you make is really valid.
Lucy, we're just going to say maybe another 3 or 4 minutes on questions.
Yeah, I think that's mainly everything from the chat. There were a couple of pre-submitted questions we could look at if people are here. So we've got one. Is Stephen Ratledge on the call? Yes, he is. Stephen asked, I would like to understand what are the barriers from the grid to connecting energy generating schemes?
So it's quite a broad question. Effectively, they have to protect the grid, and probably the easiest way to think of the grid is I kind of explain it a bit like a tree, big trunk in the middle, and then it sort of branches out, gets thinner and thinner. And by putting generation on, you're sort of adding baubles onto this. And if you're adding a really heavy bauble, you're going to snap the branch. So you have to look whereabouts you are on that grid. And if you're lucky, you'll be towards the trunk, and you can sort of put some quite considerable generation capacity on there. If you're out towards the very sort of periphery and edges, it can be quite hard to connect things on. Depending on which area you're in, you'll have a local DNO or distribution network operator, and you can usually request a connection surgery with them. So if you have a particular area they want to look at, they'll be able to tell you the strength of that branch or what capacity there is on those lines, and any sort of upcoming upgrades that they expect there. And that should be a good guide as to what's possible in your area. And there are also maps available on their websites, which can show you the relative capacities and congestion that you have at different bulk supply points and substations and so on and so forth. I hope that's a general enough answer. If there's a specific question, I'm happy to go more.
I'm just going to add one thing to that, John. Yeah. The current situation, the circumstance we're in is that even finding the possibility of connecting on the thinner branches can have a knock-on effect to the need to strengthen the thicker branches. So a distribution connected asset can require reinforcement or works on the thicker branches at the transmission level. So there's an interesting interaction which is potentially hampering even smaller projects, because they are having a cumulative effect on what the bigger branches can carry. So you may find yourself in the unfortunate circumstance, although you've only got a modest project, which is where this 1 megawatt thing comes from. I think anything above 1 megawatt, even though it's still modest, can be causing the grid a headache, which ultimately leads to delays in your connection or additional cost.
Brilliant. Thank you both, Johns. I think we're going to wrap up the questions early, so thank you very much. Before we end, I'm just going to go back to Mentimeter. So I hope you got your phones at the ready. But it'd be really good if you could just give us some feedback on maybe what your key takeaway from today's session was. So for those of you that might have joined a bit late, there's a link at the top there to join menti.com. If you go there on your phone or on your computer and you use the code, the numbers at the top, and then it should link you to this page. And if you could just give maybe a little bit of feedback about what the key takeaway that you got from this session was, that'd be really helpful. And hopefully as you type away, it will appear on the screen like magic. As you're clicking away, the next and final slide will be, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we haven't covered? So I think the point there about Natural England is a really valid one. But while you're typing on that, if you could keep that in your mind for the next slide. So some points coming up. So someone's going to check the NPPF, also permitted development rights. Yes, so there's a document, a beautiful document called the General Permitted Development Order, which is a couple hundred pages long, but that is the place to go to see what permitted development rights are available. And there is a section on renewable energy, which will tell you what is permitted. Summary of the NPPF changes are very useful, complicated but possible. I think that sums up the planning system in a nutshell. the potential improvements through the NPPF changes. Yeah, so some positive points around that. Great grid analogy from John. Yes, that was great. I've never heard that before, John. That's great, and we're probably going to nick that from now on, but we'll credit you. That's a great way to think about it. It's now worth communities considering listed buildings. Yeah, okay. Looks like in our small rural community, we probably need to pursue rooftop solar. Yeah, that's probably a good point, a good starting point. The grid still being a huge barrier. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And then we'll just go on to the last one around, is there anything else that you would like to know more about planning that we haven't covered tonight? That'd be really helpful because that could shape future sessions. Maybe there's different renewable technologies we haven't covered. Maybe there's other aspects like the natural England point that you would like to know more about. Maybe you'd like to know more about permitted development. Please let us know. Renewable energy from the seabed. Okay, cool. John and John, I take it you don't do any marine-based planning, or do you?
Oh, we'll have a run at it, but no live projects at the moment. There are some community energy hydro schemes. So Bath and West has got one. It's not commonplace, and it tends to be quite a heavily maintained system. So there's a lot of operational expenditure in cleaning it up and repairing damage from it. It does have a big plus, and it's incredibly reliable. You know exactly what the tides are going to be doing, every hour for the next, 100 years. So you can build a very solid business case off the back of it. There's very little kind of risk in the performance. But we tend to find that rooftop solar is kind of your entry level, your gateway to community energy, and then kind of build up from there. So I wouldn't take on hydro as your first project. My advice.
Thank you. We got planning for combined renewals and retrofit, the latter considering EWI in particular. Who put that? Who put that on? Do you want to say a bit more about EWI?
I think that's external wall insulation.
External wall. Local development orders, yes, we haven't covered those. That's something a local authority can do that would give, I think, planning permission, basically in principle for a particular area. That's a tool that local authorities got in their toolbox. Not many use them. Energy from anaerobic digesters, farm-based ones. A couple of people have put that. External wall insulation, conservation areas. Assessing risk of asbestos. Okay. Yeah, John.
So I'd just say on the asbestos, don't install on an asbestos roof. There are people out there that have done it. I'd never recommend doing it. It's not worth the risk. On the topic of AD, I'm not aware of community AD, but you are creating a monster that needs regular feeding with AD. So just be mindful of the impact. And you may think you have your feed sources sorted, but then there's a bad harvest or prices change, and suddenly you're not getting stuff from the local area, and you're having to kind of import stuff from miles away. But there's certainly an increasing amount of activity in sort of the smaller, micro AD stuff around the farm-based area. So it's that sector is growing, but again, it's not a community energy prospect, but certainly for farmers, that's something that we are working on.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, we've gone 1 minute over there, but that was really, really helpful feedback. We just end the webinar just by highlighting that there are 3 more webinars to go. We've got The next one is on the role of community energy in delivering local retrofit services. So people who've just mentioned retrofit might be interested in that, and that's on Tuesday, the 5th of November at the same time.
Neil,
yes.
Just a quick update on that. We're probably going to reschedule it to the 6th of November because we realised there's a bit of a clash with bonfire night. So could be a bit of a noisy background.
Okay, so that's 6th of November, not the 5th. And then the future webinar topics to round out the series are around developing business models and financing on the 26th of November and community transport projects on the 10th of December. But until then, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for giving up your time, for joining us tonight, for all your input and questions. And many thanks to John and John from Renew EV, because your input was brilliant and I think very valued from everyone who took part. But thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you.